Hi, thanks for joining us. Welcome to today's episode of JAMA Network Open Live. I'm Seth Truger, Digital Media Editor for JAMA Network Open.
Hi, and I'm Mike Berkowitz, Electronic Editor for JAMA and the JAMA Network.
So, if you're following along, as always, be sure to ask us questions. You can respond to the Facebook post or just mention us on Twitter. It turns out somebody was apparently trying to ask us questions recently on the Periscope video, and if you click it, you just give us hearts, which I'm always happy to get hearts.
Yes, I didn't see the flurry of hearts.
Yeah, but we'd love your questions too. So just send us a tweet. You can either respond to the tweet or just tag us at JAMA Network Open.
And Seth, I don't know if you're wondering why we have this winter cap here.
Well, I did notice it's very cold today.
Yes, so we're broadcasting from Chicago, where it's actually a balmy 35 degrees today, but the temperature's plummeting, and we are heading straight for the eye of a polar vortex.
Ooh, that doesn't sound good. I don't
No.
like the sound of that at all.
And you may think a polar vortex is the latest thrill ride at Six Flags Great Adventure, but it is not. It is. We are forecast for a high of minus 13 degrees on Wednesday in 48 hours.
That doesn't make any sense.
It does not make any sense, but it's a good opportunity to talk about hypothermia because that is a problem in some parts of every country, I imagine. The treatment of hypothermia is pretty straightforward, which is you warm up the patient, right?
Right, yep.
And do you see that a lot in the emergency room?
Yeah, we do see a fair amount, mostly with patients who are homeless, unfortunately, and just exposed to the elements, don't have places to go. One of the things we've done in our hospital is we have a warming center, so we don't have to play the game of, oh yeah, I've got chest pain, I need to be in the ER. Patients can just select to go to a place where we can keep them warm and inside for the night.
That's great. So
Or
they
not
don't
patients.
even need to check in
Yep.
and be triaged, right?
Yep.
And the ones that do, is it anything more than warm blankets and just kind of managing their meds?
I mean, it's mostly wound care, warming appropriately without burning patients. I've been fortunate and haven't seen a lot of severe hypothermia in patients.
Right.
But unfortunately, some patients, get some serious stuff like need amputations, lose digits, it's tough.
Is that right? So cold-induced injury.
Yep.
And what about, I'm kind of going back to a really old hard drive in my brain. I remember something about peritoneal lavage with warm fluids. Is anybody doing that anymore?
I've read about that in books.
Right. And warming up, actually like zapping IV bags for like 10
Yeah.
seconds on a microwave and warming up your saline. I think probably we shouldn't be doing that anymore, right?
Yeah, I mean, realistically, if it were to happen, I think there'd be probably a lot of Googling and also a lot of taking what we use for therapeutic hypothermia and doing the opposite.
Okay, so no sympathy necessary, but here in Chicago, we'll be at minus 13 degrees on Wednesday, so stay in touch with your weather channel, and we are going to launch right in now to the latest 3 articles.
Right, so we're going to start with the first article, Injuries Associated with Standing Electric Scooter Use by Tarek Trivedi and colleagues from the University of California, LA.
I've seen these on the street, standing electronic scooters. These are kind of scooters that are electronic. They're not the ones that burst into flames, are they? And that's not the injuries that are covered here.
No,
right?
that's not what they found. But these, I had no idea about these until I went to ASAP in San Diego in October. And apparently there's a bunch of cities where it's basically kind of like Uber comes in and takes over and there's suddenly a bunch of Ubers around. There's just scooters all over the place. And there's electric scooters. They're run by a couple different companies. I think Lime and Bird are the 2 big ones. And you just go up to the scooter with your app. You rent it for a couple hours or whatever time period, and you get this little electric scooter, and then you just leave it wherever you're
So
done.
I didn't know that. So it's kind of like a ride share with an electronic scooter.
Yeah, it's exactly what it is. And I mean, it is silly. It's like an infestation.
Well, I'll tell you, anticipating what we're going to talk about with this, I mean, there are bike shares, obviously, in lots of cities, and I've always thought it represents something of a public health threat because they're not renting helmets with the bicycles. They're just giving you bicycles. And I would like to see the data on whether bike share programs in cities have led to any head injuries. I also know, being a cycler myself, that they're always going really, really slow down the street. These things can't actually go that fast, and I wonder whether that reduces injury. It just seems like it might be an interesting ER or public health-oriented research study.
Yeah, so I definitely, when City Bike and Ventra, the bike share programs first started, I was very concerned. There need to be, figure out some way to do helmets with maybe like little shower caps that go inside so you don't get lice or things like that, because bike share plus lice share would be very bad.
Right.
What I've seen, I am not at all an expert in bike
I don't
share
expect you to be.
bike
Right.
share public safety, but I'm surprised the little bit of data that I've come across hasn't been that bad. And I think it's from what you say, it's people using them who are tourists, using them casually, using them for commutes in pretty big congested cities where you can't go that fast. So far, I'm cautiously reassured that I've been wrong, and I haven't seen a ton of injuries myself, for whatever that's worth. I think it seems similar to some of the numbers I've seen where a lot of cities in Europe that have different bike properties than us as far as a city just don't get the same kind of head injuries that our cyclists do. So that's nice, I guess.
Right, it is good, but then there's these data about electric scooter use in Southern California.
Right. Yeah. So what these guys did, and this is a bunch of emergency docs, some people that I know, like Natasha Wheaton, Dave Schrager, who's a JAMA associate editor,
Yep.
and Tarek, who's great. They looked at basically all the scooter injuries they could find at the two main UCLA hospitals, Ronald Reagan and Santa Monica. They found 250 in about a one year period, and they found it was a fair amount of pretty substantial injuries, mostly musculoskeletal stuff, a lot of head injuries, a handful of pretty serious head injuries like intracranial injuries, a handful of serious intra-abdominal injuries, mostly what you'd expect: fractures, sprains, strains, but also the burden of getting an injury bad enough to come to the ER. A lot of people needed EMS. A non-trivial percentage were sick enough to be trauma activations from triage. About 80% got some sort of radiographs or CTs. So a bunch got admitted to the hospital. And about 10% of the patients they saw were people who were hit by people on scooters. They weren't the passengers on the scooters.
They were hit by people on scooters. Oh, I thought, okay, because about 10% were non-riders, I thought they might be like, behind their boyfriend or girlfriend, hugging them like they do on motorcycles or something like that.
No, I think what it meant was the people who were hit by the drivers.
That probably makes more sense. Somehow I was imagining it the other way. So is this surprising? When I first read this, I thought, case series, okay, kind of a modest first step into the field of this kind of public health injury research about this kind of relatively new form of transportation on the streets, these scooter sharing with cyclists and with automobiles, but not particularly surprising. I don't know how to calibrate this prevalence or this. It's a prevalence, right, or is it an incidence? It's probably
an incidence at first.
Incidence of injury, right, and then it turns into a prevalence. I don't know how to calibrate this. Are these more dangerous as means of transportation? These scooters, or are they about what you would expect from things with wheels?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, is the things with wheels. The question is, I mean, for me, the big question as far as the epidemiology is, what's the alternative? Are these people who otherwise would have been walking, so they have a small chance of getting hit by a car, but otherwise walking is pretty safe? Or is it people who otherwise would be driving or riding a bicycle, which case they'd be at risk for, more at risk for other injuries? I would expect that this is more walkers who got upgraded to wheels than downgraded, but I don't really know. That's just off the top of my head.
Right.
I hadn't really thought about that. There was some news coverage of this. This paper, Tarek was on CBS News with this, and the response that the scooter companies had was, well, we don't know what the denominator is. There's lots of people riding the scooters, and there is an actual question there. It's if there's 1 million people riding these scooters, there's 1 million scooter miles, and there's only a handful of serious injuries, that's much more reassuring.
Right.
I doubt the numbers are that favorable, because in 1 year, 250 250 injuries, with a third of them being fairly serious, is not small.
I guess the other question I have, which may or may not be fair and is probably unprovable, are the streets of Los Angeles more threatening, more dangerous? Do they eat you up when you're on a scooter more than the streets of Manhattan or Chicago or some other city?
Right. Well, I mean, the LA traffic could be a pro or a con here.
Right.
I learned also that apparently you can't ride these on the sidewalks. You have to ride them on the street, or I guess designated paths.
By law, you mean?
By law, yeah.
Okay.
In the city, it's local law.
Okay.
Which I guess is great for the pedestrians who aren't getting hit, which is why the number is only 8 or 10%. But probably puts the riders at bigger risk of being hit by a car than if they weren't on a road, obviously.
Got it. And no information here about whether people took their scooter to the emergency room after they were injured on it.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you're already going to be racking up a big emergency department bill. You don't want to keep doing the $2 an hour or whatever it is for your scooter.
Right. Uber and parking, you may as well just take your scooter.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so interesting. You'll see these on the streets in your city, township, or town probably soon enough. They do seem to be a trend, at least until the next trend comes along. The authors call this a disruptive force in short-term transportation. It didn't seem that disruptive to me because I've seen them, but I haven't seen them grow in the past year or two in Chicago. But I don't know what that means.
I don't think we really have them here. I think it's cities get a contract with the specific companies, and then they just test. When I was in San Diego, this is back in October, it was they were just everywhere. They were taking over.
Okay.
It was I don't know.
All right.
It's pretty bad.
So stay tuned for more.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll learn some public health lessons. See, maybe helmet laws would be good. Apparently California had a helmet law and it got repealed.
That happened in Pennsylvania a number of years ago, and the ED and public health community was up in arms, but I never saw follow-up data that demonstrated an increase in head injuries that you would expect and was the reason to object for it. But the motorcycle lobby was strong and got the state legislature to repeal the helmets as a requirement. So.
Yeah, which motorcycles are a whole different story, and frankly, I don't have a problem if you want to ride a motorcycle, just make sure you wear a helmet and you're an organ donor.
But if you're a graduate student, if you're a medical student, this is great research because there's usually kind of public-oriented data sets that would allow you to look at this and these questions that need to be answered and can influence health policy.
Yep, absolutely.
Great. What do you have next?
Next paper we've got is Patterns in Outpatient Benzodiazepine Prescribing in the United States by Suman Agarwal and Bruce Landon.
Okay, so this is straight kind of bread and butter pharmacoepidemiology, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
So what these two did is they looked at the NAMC's CDC data for outpatient visits and looked at how much benzos were prescribed from 2013 through 2015 and a bunch of the different correlations and things in there and how things change over time.
Okay. So I've heard a lot about vitamin D, and this is vitamin where D stands for diazepam, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Fortunately, I don't see it used like that very much.
Right.
But yeah, it's the classic mother's little helper.
The mother, right? MLH.
Yeah.
Okay.
Date ourselves.
What do we know from the data here?
So unfortunately, it looks like outpatient benzodiazepine prescribing has got up quite a bit from 2003 through 2015. I, in general, am pretty concerned about how unsafe benzodiazepines can be as outpatient medications, especially in the context of the opioid epidemic. If nothing else, there's some very concerning data that co-prescribing of benzos and opioids is pretty bad and is a basically synergistic risk for death and overdose. And I think that's bad. We've also seen a fair amount of pretty decent studies that benzodiazepines don't necessarily do what we want them to do in certain circumstances. There's a great study on Valium and back pain showing that it just, 2 weeks of diazepam added to outpatient back pain regimens from the ED doesn't lead to any increase in symptoms or improvement in symptoms.
Improvement in symptoms, right.
And, I think it's one of those things we're like, oh, it's a muscle relaxant. I see some spasm, and I'm skeptical that we can do that. And
right. Well, so on the first count, so they document an increase in the co-prescription of benzos with opioids. They say it quadruples. It's still a low rate from 0.5% in the beginning year, 2003, to 2%. So that's still low. It wasn't clear to me whether these were prescription opioids or whether we can't tell from here whether the clinicians actually knew that they were co-prescribing or whether the patient neglected to mention, forgot to mention, it just wasn't part of the record when they gave benzos. Around kind of pain control, I think my sense is that clinicians don't misunderstand that benzodiazepines are good for analgesia, but there's certainly a lot of anxiety around these visits, and benzos are good as anxiolytics. They may not be the cleanest drugs anymore, but people say, I can't sleep. People, you can feel the anxiety and the tension in these visits oftentimes, and so you hand out a few of these things to say, like, maybe this will settle you down.
Yeah, and it's tough. I don't blame the clinician specifically because we have a lot of problems. We know that opioids are dangerous. We know that opioids are addictive. We know that lots of patients have risk factors for reasons why, say, they can't take NSAIDs. We know lots of things that don't work for pain, like we've talked about before. So trying to do other things is certainly reasonable when patients have pain and have symptoms that we want to control. But it's definitely concerning. One of the things that's most interesting to me is when they looked at the prescribing by specialty, the psychiatrists aren't prescribing benzos anymore.
I was going to comment on that. Right. This isn't coming from the shrinks, right?
Yep. So maybe they were already maxed out, but
no, I don't think so because the percents here aren't all that damaging.
No, it's really not that bad. But if you look at Figure 2, they compare. They look at the rates of how primary care docs are prescribing, and then there's also some graphs looking at how specialists and medical specialists and surgeons are prescribing, and the rates have all gone up. And I think, in the context of knowing that a lot of patients are taking opioids either that we're prescribing or that they're getting from the gray or black market, or using recreationally, benzos are addictive, lead to withdrawal, lead to all sorts of problems. I learned in med school that breathing is very important in really simple terms.
Right. So I was wondering whether there's a lot of conversation now here in the States about because of the opioid misuse epidemic, about finding substitute medications. So it may be ascribing too much intent. more intent than these data can support, but whether docs are kind of using benzos as a kind of a substitute for opioids, and whether, because it's not the psychiatrists who may know these drugs well and may have moved on to their own kind of next generation anxiolytics or psychotropics, whether it's the primary care docs who are just pressed for time, these patients are really kind of disabled by their pain or the anxiety about their pain, and they're saying, just try this. It's kind of a time-saving measure because it's much easier to give a prescription, and the patients are happier walking out the door than sitting and trying to talk people through things and trying these alternative and complementary therapies that we've talked about in a JNO live session before.
Yep, but again, I'm an optimist. One of the upsides of really clunky EHRs is that it's hard to write prescriptions sometimes. So that it's like one more little piece of friction that makes it harder for me to write an easy prescription for something that might be dangerous.
And why is that? Do you have a prior auth or something like that?
Oh, no, just the computers are terrible.
Okay. Okay. I'm sure we'll talk about electronic health records in a future in a future opportunity.
Yeah, we'll get some. But yeah, so looking at the numbers here, the rates didn't increase that much for anxiety or depression prescribing. But for benzos being prescribed for back or chronic pain, did go up from about 3.5% to 8.5%.
Okay.
Didn't change for for insomnia. But yeah, it's now up to about 30% of psychiatrist visits result in benzo prescriptions, and primary care visits. Let's see, they went from 3.5% to 7.5% of primary care visits in NAMCs result in a benzodiazepine prescription, and that, because there's so many primary care visits, that's about half of the benzodiazepine prescriptions nationwide.
And as a physician and as a just citizen, we've heard a lot about kind of the bad actors in terms of the manufacturers and Purdue Pharmaceuticals and how they really over-promoted opioids, and that arguably led to an increase in usage. We talked about that last week, in fact. I'm not aware of any marketing campaigns over this period of time that really asked me as a physician and as a prescriber to prescribe benzodiazepine. So this is the first instance, I think, where we can't actually attribute it to marketing and detailing. Yeah. Now, I may well be wrong there. If you have a different experience and you're watching, please leave it in the comments so we can respond and learn from you. Yep. But are you aware of the marketing influence here? There's no adverse effects there as far as I know.
No, I haven't heard of any, or I'm not familiar, I haven't come across any major marketing for benzodiazepines. I've seen some kind of decades-old kind of hokey ads that people show, like Ativan. And I think there's one from the 80s that looks like the cover of a sci-fi book. That gets around.
Right, but it's been a while.
Yeah, but even, the main name brands we know are Valium, Ativan, Versed. These are meds that, I don't think any of them have been on patent or anyone's been trying to sell these in a long time.
Right, and Klonopin too. It's like an oldie but goodie. People continue to use them. Yep. People can use it for sleep as a soporific, but nothing coming up.
No, so again, I think your point about doctors trying to substitute for opioids or try to make do, it's kind of more glue or chewed up chewing gum in the little cracks of the system, trying to figure out what we can to help people.
Right. So maybe it comes from a good place, but if you're a doc out there, keep these numbers in mind, that the trend has been going up, and there may be better ways to treat patients. That's ultimately your call in the patient visit.
Yep. All right.
What else?
Right. Last one we've got today is the association between financial incentives and participant deception about study eligibility by Khalid Fernandez Lynch and colleagues.
So this is an interesting study that I'm not sure I completely understood. I'm hoping you can explain it to me.
So I've had to read it a number of times. It's a little complicated. So it's interesting. We learn a bit, or there's a lot of inside baseball on study methodology, on how research is done, and how basically the research scientists deceive the people who are studying to see, find out how people act in different situations or how people are going to react to different things. This is looking at a different thing. It's basically they are giving participants in a fake survey different amounts of cash rewards between $5 and $20, and then seeing if the participants are lying about whether or not they're eligible to take the ostensible survey.
So let me just stop you right there. Yeah. Was it a fake survey in order to answer this research question, or was it a survey that they were administering anyways, and then they're describing this phenomenon in the process? Because then if the deceit is two ways, even more problematic, right?
To be honest, I'm not sure if they were doing anything with the actual data they were getting.
Okay.
I thought it was all just this kind of, they were actually asking people questions.
Right.
They
I
didn't
mean,
know.
I presume that that this is an epiphenomenon of they're trying to answer some other
You
question.
got to slice the salami, right?
Right. Okay.
Yeah. But basically, they asked people, recruited people to do a survey on their attitudes towards vaccines. And they told some of the people that in order to be eligible for the survey, you need to have had a flu vaccine recently.
Okay.
And they told other people that in order to be eligible for the survey, you couldn't have had a flu vaccine recently.
Okay.
And compared the rates of how the respondents said they either did or didn't have a flu vaccine in the last few months.
Okay. So had a vaccine, didn't have a vaccine, and that there's a gradation in the incentive also,
Yep.
right?
So there was a control group where they said, have you had any vaccine at any point in your life, just to kind of catch pretty much anybody. It makes sense. Most people or lots of people have had vaccines at some point, usually before they're of age to make decisions themselves about it. Whereas a flu vaccine, you can usually, decide I'm an adult, I'm going to go get a flu vaccine, or I don't want a flu vaccine.
Right.
And then they did a 4 different $5, $10, or $20 levels. Either told people they were eligible if they did have a flu vaccine this year, or were not eligible if they did have a flu vaccine this year.
Okay, and I'll make 2 comments. One is that they told potential participants in this study or whatever study they were doing that they were doing a survey study about attitudes towards vaccines. Obviously, people are interested in that. And it's pretty common to offer some kind of small incentive to get people to complete a survey. Because survey research can be difficult. It's easy to ignore a survey, and that non-response actually ends up compromising the inferences you can make from your final sample. So it's pretty common to, at least in the old days, to mail $5 just to kind of nudge somebody towards wanting to complete a survey and then maybe follow up with $10. Right. It's all kind of in the cost of the research. And so in this instance, the incentive was $5, $10, and $20, right? In the active intervention group, influenza versus non-influenza, have you ever had, compared to people who were given no incentive, I think, but said, have you ever had a vaccine? No, they were given $5.
Everyone was given at least $5.
Right. Okay.
So that's actually one of, for me, what I would like to see is a group that didn't get any money. And was asked, did you or did you not, and would you be eligible? Because it's interesting because there's no dose response here. So if you look at the figure, the big black bar on the far right is the people who got $5 but just had to have any vaccine at any point in their life. And then it alternates between, did you have a recent flu vaccine? Did you not have a recent flu vaccine? And you can see the people who needed to have a flu vaccine recently in order to be eligible for their money to be in the study reported they were more likely that they did at a higher rate than those who didn't, suggesting there is an effect of giving people money and saying, hey, you can be in the study, but only if you meet these criteria. And people say, yeah, I meet those criteria.
So I'm not sure I completely get it, but I think the takeaway that the authors want us to have is that people are more inclined to say that they have had a flu vaccine in order to participate in a study through which they get some money.
Right.
The incentive actually, is it a statistical argument that they're more likely to say they've had something that they haven't, because they're not confirming that they never had a flu vaccine?
Yeah, they never confirmed, but if you look at the numbers, they've got 325 people in every group. And if you look at the people who didn't have to answer if they had a flu vaccine recently, their reporting rate was right in the middle of those two. And then basically everyone who got money for saying they had a flu vaccine was at a higher rate and didn't below. So
got it.
It's certainly, and these were this is randomized appropriately. There's not selection bias here. So these patients were probably lying about it.
Right. So saying you have to have had a flu vaccine in order to participate led to higher rates of people saying they had a flu vaccine, which just prima facie is likely to be people inclined to say something that may or may not have been true.
Right. Again, the fact that there's no dose response is a little interesting, although if I'm taking a 5-minute survey, whether it's $5 or $20, I would rather have $20 than not have $20. I'd rather $20 than $5, but I don't know if it's enough to totally change my behavior, so it may not be a big enough dose to get a dose response. So again, I would have liked to see a control group with just no incentive here, or maybe 2 more arms, no incentive here, or just a much bigger, $100 is probably enough for me to, I got a flu vaccine. Yeah, that was 6 months ago.
So, some takeaway points here, I think, are if you're a survey researcher, and we probably imagine that very few of our viewers are, just be aware of this potential bias in the incentives you offer. There's no kind of clear win here about offering, not offering, but you need to be aware of the phenomenon.
Right.
And all of us get phone calls or things in the mail or email surveys. And we should probably be aware of our own inclination either to deceive or not deceive,
Right.
or how we're responding. And be aware that the researchers are dependent on your response. That doesn't mean you can or should be answering every survey.
Right.
But whenever I take a flight, for example, how was your experience? I try to fill that one out at least quickly. And good survey researchers will give you a very, very short version and then ask you if you're willing to take more questions. If it's going to be 1 minute, I usually give them my time.
Yep. And we're using, I think, some loaded words here like deception and lying and stuff like that. And it's not all, people sitting there tenting their fingers and, I'm going to get that $20.
Right. No, of course.
A lot of it's, I had a flu shot. Was that 7 months ago or was that 3 months ago? It was 3 months ago. It's fine. They
Right.
need people in the study.
Right. Okay, so that's pretty much of a wrap for today's articles, right?
Yeah, so those are the articles we're talking about today from Friday's release. Of course, go to JAMANetworkOpen.com and read these and more. They're all free online for you to look at. And join us next week, Monday, 2 o'clock at Central Time again.
We will be past our polar vortex. Can we call up that picture again? Because I want to show how the cold air is coming straight from the Arctic right to Chicago. We're in the crosshairs, and it is perhaps no coincidence that on the Star Tracker or Sky Tracker map, the polar vortex is JAMA Network Open pink. So we are perfectly situated for what we're going to go through, and I think we will be back on the other end of it where it's supposed to be in the 40s. It's supposed to be like a 60-degree gradient between today at 35, our dip into the minus 20s, and then back up into the 40s over the weekend. Isn't that something?
That is crazy. And if our use of branded colors has done anything to attract that cold here, I apologize.
Yes. So we'll squash that
Right.
and get that out of the way, and hope to see you next week. Thanks for watching. Tell your friends about this. Share the tweet or the post, however you're viewing this. Follow us on JAMA Network Open. You can sign up for emails. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And our next release is Friday at 10 a.m.
Great. Take care.
Take care. Thanks for visiting. Bye.